to this session on funding shocks and the strategic impact on the humanitarian system. As you see, we've just started the recording for you to consent to also. This session is part of a series that KUNO is organizing. It's the second session. The series is called On the Changing World Order and Its Implications for Humanitarian Action. We had an excellent first session some weeks ago about the collapse of the liberal world order. And this time it is time to zoom in a little bit more on, so what is the strategic impact of these funding shocks that are cutting all through the system, of course the USAID cuts, but also other cuts across the globe. We are very keen to be hosting two excellent speakers today that will give their views on this large question that is hanging over all of us at the moment. Before I introduce them, please allow me to say some words about KUNO for those of you that are not very familiar with it yet. KUNO is a knowledge platform by and for the Dutch humanitarian field. So it is supported by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it consists of a wide network of members that consist of humanitarian organizations in the Netherlands, but also a range of knowledge institutes that are doing work on humanitarian action. The aim of KUNO is to share and deepen knowledge across this field by bringing together actors from the field to have difficult conversations or wider conversations to really reflect and share knowledge. So this lunch meeting is part of a series indeed that KUNO is hosting in response to these major events that are happening. We are having the second session here out of 4 sessions. This series leads up to a larger conference that KUNO will be hosting in June. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our excellent speakers who each will give their contributions. And then after their contributions, you're very welcome to pose your questions. We will start with Themrise Khan, all the way from Ottawa, Canada, very early in the morning. Themrise is a very well-known voice in the field, of course. I'm sure that you have seen or heard her perspectives. And she's an independent development professional and a publicist. And we're in for a treat, I would say. And then Themrise will be followed by Arjan Hehenkamp, who is now the crisis lead for Sudan at the International Rescue Committee and also has a long track record in the humanitarian field. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him as well. So Themrise, can I hand over the floor to you?
Thank you very much, Corinne, and thank you, KUNO, for the invitation today. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. I apologize if my voice doesn't come off as clear. It's 6:30 in the morning here, and I was up late watching the election results here in Canada. So forgive me if I'm a little bit. There's a lot to talk about today, obviously. And I would just like to start with, I suppose, my approach towards the entire idea of aid, be it development aid or humanitarian aid, and that is that its time is now over. I say that in a much larger context of foreign aid, and that is not just because of the cuts made by Donald Trump, but that's something I've always been saying over time, that it's time we came up, particularly in the Global South, with a completely new way of doing things that would reduce our dependency on the Western world in particular. The idea of humanitarian aid, however, has always been sort of a gray area in this conversation, because it is far more vital than development aid. But because it is part of the same ecosystem as foreign aid, it has suffered and continues to suffer from the same anomalies that we see overall in the foreign aid system. And so those are issues of power, domination, control. As we see now, humanitarian emergencies are increasing around the world, but the humanitarian aid industry, at least the Western humanitarian aid industry, is becoming more and more selective about which humanitarian catastrophe it decides to invest in or go after or assist. Now, a lot of those are political decisions, which is one of the main negatives and drawbacks of the foreign aid ecosystem, is that this is a politicized ecosystem. So all decisions are also ultimately that are made are political. They are not necessarily humanitarian. And so I think that is one thing that we need to keep in mind, particularly for the people who constantly call for more aid rather than less aid. And we constantly hear calls about the humanitarian aid system being underfunded. I don't think it's a matter of underfunding. I think it's a matter of being selective about where you want to be as well. The other side of that is the fact that every country in the world has had its own humanitarian system in some way or another, formally or informally. You can't say that no country has the capacity, quote unquote, which is a word we use very often in the aid industry, that any country doesn't have the capacity to assist its own people. I'll give you the example of Pakistan, my own country of origin. We had devastating floods about 3 years ago that inundated the country. And I gave a presentation on this at KUNO in The Hague 3 years ago as well. That, a third of the country was underwater, 33 million people displaced. It was a catastrophe that we hadn't seen in decades in our own country, at least not in my lifetime. And considering the international humanitarian responses we've had in the past to other catastrophes, this one was very tepid. And we did have humanitarian agencies who were already on the ground and who were already in Pakistan assist. Obviously, that was part of their job and their mandate. But the response was nowhere near to what it should have been for a catastrophe of this magnitude. And so from day one, what we call local first responders, and I've never really understood that word, because when you say first responders, it conjures up a very formal, like you have medics or you have trained people who know how to get people out in emergency. You've got firefighters, et cetera, et cetera. But our first responders are basically just citizens. In Pakistan's case, it was literally villagers helping other villagers. It was people coming from urban areas and cities like mine, Karachi's, getting into their cars, literally packing in whatever supplies they could find and just driving out to the affected areas and helping. And that response was so galvanized, which is normally the case in every emergency response that you see in many countries. It is exactly, it's not that they just happen to be there. It's just, what else are they supposed to do, right? So this romanticizing of local first responders, I think, is something we also need to be cautious about, because what happened was, we did need international assistance at a very, very high and technical level in this particular case because we just could not handle it. We had kilometers, provinces, districts underwater. We needed boats, we needed specialized equipment to rescue people. And we didn't have a lot of access to that. And our own government also sort of forsook us. It was literally the people on the ground who were doing whatever they could. But that ethos, what I'm trying to say is that ethos is there in every country, and it is that ethos that needs to be cultivated and supported, not completely come and replaced by international aid agencies, which is what we see happening in many humanitarian disasters over the world. So that's another anomaly in the sector that I think we need to be aware of. It's a hard call, I think. I think humanitarian aid, I've always tried to distinguish between development aid, which is your more soft power aid of investing in education, health, social services, etc., and humanitarian aid, which is specifically disaster and conflict centered. There has to be a separation because the objectives of the two are completely different. They're day and night. Development aid is something we can very easily do without if we are able to turn around our own systems. Humanitarian aid is something that is altruistic in nature and needs to be more global in its approach. But the politicization of humanitarian aid is something that we see increasingly all around the world. So we've got Palestine as a massive example. We've got Sudan as a massive example. We've got Yemen as a massive example, where aid is so desperately needed, but it's not just the global politics that's affecting it. It is also a regional politics that affects it. You know, the area, that the location, the region needs to be very, I hate to say this, but at times, you know, popular for humanitarian agencies to go in with the same level of effort that they do in other countries. So I think it's a very murky and complicated world, and humanitarian aid doesn't need to be complicated because it has a very simple objective. Basically, in this case, you do have to go and save lives, whereas in development aid, saving lives is basically just a way of saying, you know, we know better than you do. So I think that distinction needs to be made very clear between the two. But I think humanitarian aid is also morphing into development aid, and development aid is morphing into humanitarian aid. And that separation needs to be very clear, which is how we will know exactly how to respond and where to respond. I think I may have exceeded my time, so I'll end there, but I will be happy to answer questions. Over to you. Thank you, Corinne.
You have not exceeded your time, no.
Good
But
to
we
know.
will hear more from you indeed in the questions, and we look forward. Thank you so much, Themrise. Some strong arguments and statements indeed, also for what you ended on, the need for a clear separation. So I think I'm interested to hear also what the room thinks about that in relation to the nexus approach that, of course, also has been part of the conversations. But we will, I think, return to that in the questions. But first, indeed, Arjan, we would like to hear from you. Please have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Corinne and KUNO, for inviting me. And thank you all for devoting your lunch to listening to myself and Themrise. I wanted to start with two statistics I looked up in preparation for this call. So 25 years ago, the combined total of the consolidated humanitarian appeal for the United Nations worldwide was $4 billion. Today, and this is after ruthless prioritization, the UN humanitarian response plan is in excess of 40 billion. 25 years ago, the average annual costs of Operation Lifeline Sudan, which basically was in response to the war in Sudan when it was still one country, was 50 to 70 million per year. Today, the humanitarian response plan, after massive reductions and prioritization for South Sudan and for Sudan combined, is over 5 billion, 100 times what it was 25 years ago. So this is, there's been a massive increase in the budget that has been allocated to humanitarian action over the past 25 years. And so it's interesting to look back a little what happened over that period of time. And if I do so, and evidently I will be a bit reductionist and a bit selective, I see three main issues that have changed over time. First is that, during the Cold War, so this is till the end of the 1990s, there was a significant interest in investment of the Soviet Union and of the West in some of the peripheral or in the southern countries in Africa and Asia, in order to be able to sustain their political interest and to sustain friendly states and friendly governments in those states. That political interest basically disappeared after the end of the Cold War. And so the political interest of the West was no longer essential to maintain those relationships with those countries in Africa. From that moment onwards, much of the aid was basically delegated towards multilateral institutions and the UN and NGOs. The multilateral institutions, under the dominance of the liberal West from the 1990s, basically put a massive pressure on all states in Africa, but also in Asia, to divest from public service provision. And so there was a lot of pressure for states in Africa to reduce their budgets and to start reducing the delivery of public services towards their population. And this then resulted basically in a situation whereby UN and NGOs became the preferred mode of intervention in many of these countries. The reduction and retraction of Western interest and Western funding and multilateral funding, the reduction of states and their own investment in public services basically created a major vacuum within which the UN and NGOs stepped into. This was at a time when there was evidently a lot of conflict going on post-Cold War in Asia as well as in Africa. So what did UN and NGOs do? They, first of all, in the first phase, rapidly expanded into humanitarian action, which was fairly marginal up until the end of the 80s. It was much more developmental action under the political architecture of the Cold War. And so there was a massive expansion into humanitarian issues, and in the absence, in the 2000s, the end of the 90s, in the absence of any other form of political intervention, political or economic intervention, the UN and the NGOs started asking themselves, should we be doing more? Should we be basically stepping into areas which were normally taken care of by different forms of political or macroeconomic or macro financial interventions that were taken care of by states up until that point. And so this has caused us to basically massively expand the purpose and the scope and the time frame as well as the activities that are taking place under what was initially fairly limited a humanitarian project, which was life-saving in acute situations of violence. This is what Hugo Streme refers to as the humanitarian Christmas tree. Now, he basically says it's a metaphor for humanitarians basically having decorated the humanitarian Christmas tree with all sorts of ornaments, never taking anything off, but only adding to the Christmas tree and overloading it with ornaments that we can no longer afford and we can no longer, through which we can no longer see the tree. And I would take it a step further. I think that we have not only over-decorated the Christmas tree, we have basically created a wood full of over-decorated Christmas trees over the past 25 years. And so this has meant that basically we are nowadays, humanitarian actions covers everything. It covers food security in Kenya, where there's a government that is fairly well organized, that has its own competencies, that has reasonable governance, not perfect, but reasonable governance, to providing life-saving assistance in and around Al Fasher in Sudan, and anything in between. It also includes forms of medical support, HIV/AIDS, notably, so PEPFAR initiative, but taking place in countries which have the capacities and the budget in order to be able to do so themselves, but have chosen not to, like, for instance, in the case of South Africa, because the PEPFAR initiative of the United States has been able to do that for them. So there's a wide range of different activities in different situations, which has meant that humanitarian action has become to mean, it's become meaningless in effect. It's become everything for all people in all situations all the time. And so the brutal cuts, which are brutal, and there's no denying the brutality and the cruelty of the cuts of the Trump administration, and in addition, all the cuts that have been taken, that have been made by the Dutch government and other governments in Europe, basically poses to, with a fundamental question, which is, are we able to continue to maintain that Christmas tree, that wood full of Christmas trees that are fully decorated, or are we going to focus our efforts on the situations which we deem to be the most priority within humanitarian action? And my argument would be that humanitarian action is a particular and specific form of action, which is at its most legitimate and effective in situations where there's intense and violent polarization and contestation of power, and where there's not only no capacity, but there's no will of the government to intervene itself, or the government or its institutions to intervene itself and to take care of the well-being of its own population. And it's in response to vital needs. It's not, Hugo Slim makes another interesting distinction. He says humanitarian action is for life-saving activities. It's not for life-making activities. It's the vital and basic needs of the people that we respond to. If we can also contribute towards themselves undertaking activities that are life-making, that are fully satisfying all their needs within their existence, that's great. But our core purpose is to respond to life-saving needs. And I would therefore conclude that the brutal cuts by the Trump administration offer us not only a necessity, but also an opportunity to go back to what the core is of humanitarian action, which is to intervene in 3 situations. One is a situation of active conflict or situations of intense violence, so intense that it approximates active conflict. The second situation is one of malign neglect, when there's a deliberate and a systematic discrimination of a particular need or a particular population or a group within a society. And the third situation are acute phases of disasters or outbreaks where the local capacity is overwhelmed in the first instance by the disaster that strikes, such as in the case of Pakistan. Those are the only situations in which I think humanitarian action is legitimate and effective and necessary for a fairly short period of time. In all other situations, we should be asking ourselves, what other forms of intervention are much better and much more effective and much more possible? For instance, through, in the case of Kenya, debt relief, giving basically the fiscal space to the Kenyan government to make its own choices and to invite NGOs, or not, as the case may be, in order to be able to deal with some of the multiple challenges that they also face with in that particular country. Yes, let's not do less with less, but let's do more in less situations. Let's focus on fewer situations and do as much as we possibly can for the people within those situations. I will end with just an example. I saw a press release of OCHA the other day, which basically says we've had to go through brutal cuts in order to be able to adapt ourselves to the reduced budget. And I said we pulled out of 7 different countries, including Zimbabwe, Eritrea, Colombia, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan. And my question would have been, what were you doing there in the first place? Those are countries where there's functioning governments, there are functioning institutions. It's not perfect, but they are there. They have capacities, they have competencies. OCHA is there in order to be able to be an external coordinator of humanitarian assistance in those countries. That is not necessary. You should not have been there anymore in the first place. And so, yes, we have to make some painful choices, but I think those are the right choices to make in order to be able to focus our efforts on those situations and those countries where there's still a massive need, where there's little capacity, and there's almost no will in order to be able to address the life-threatening situations of citizens, such as in the case of Sudan or Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well, Arjan, with also a very clear call to the field. Yeah, I think I see a thread between or across both of your contributions, actually, for a much more clear and specific delineation of what humanitarian action is and what is development, I guess. Yeah, I'm intrigued, and I'm very keen to open the floor also to questions that I'm sure we have in the room. We have people from different sectors, if you will. So I'm welcoming everyone to come in with questions or comments or observations. Paul, I will give the floor to you, and in the meantime, keep raising your hands. We will collect a number of questions before we hand it back to Themrise and Arjan to respond to. Paul, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks a lot, Corinne, and thanks, Themrise and Arjan, for your I think thought-provoking reflections. But I think these are needed in these times of crisis. And if I listen to you well, you also see this as an opportunity to go back to the core business and to get rid of things that have developed over years, over decades, that have led to this Christmas tree, as you said. I was wondering, because the humanitarian ecosystem is quite complex. I already mentioned UN OCHA as one of the maybe most important players, UN appeals, etc. Do you also have ideas about how we should revamp the governance of that humanitarian ecosystem? So, because now it's quite, I think, I mean, it is organized, but it's also, there's a lot of autonomy for organizations, of course, to make their own decisions and to member states of the UN. But if you really want to, well, make it radically different, I think you also need to work on the infrastructure and the governance of the humanitarian system. I was wondering if you have concrete suggestions on that. And secondly, Corinne, you already mentioned the triple nexus, which was, I think, the fashion in the last couple of years to think about how to align between humanitarian aid, development, and peace. What should we do with that? Because if I listen to you well, you have a strong plea for continuation or maybe even intensification of humanitarian aid, but then with a very clear and well, strong mandate, getting rid of all the sort of extras. But what should then happen with the efforts to, better align the efforts also on the development front? Because otherwise we might run into the situation that we continue providing humanitarian aid in context without a way out, right? I mean that of course was the original idea, to also find a way out and to hand over and to make sure that governance or local civil society organizations are able to work towards their own prosperous future. So 2 questions.
Thank you, Paul. And sorry, I forgot to say, could you also introduce yourself? Because some of us may know you.
Sure.
We see your name, but also your role.
Paul van den Berg. I work in Coordate as a political advisor.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, so you're also asking indeed about, but also about these structural issues, how to address those. Yeah. All right, do we have anyone else that would like to pose a question at this point? I'm sure that some of you have heard this and have questions.
Polly has a question.
Polly, please go ahead. Yeah.
I thought I'd jump in because awkward silences make me nervous, and seeing as no one else was going to ask this, I thought I would jump in. So hi, I'm Polly Pallister-Wilkins. I'm an associate professor at the University of Amsterdam. So I have a question, and so I'm totally on board with everything that Themrise and Arjan have said. But I'm wondering who makes these decisions. If we are going to do less, if we are going to focus more on the core elements of humanitarianism, which is saving lives, who is going to decide that? Because the sector is so complicated. Do we leave it up to individual institutions? Is there something we want to institutionalize within OCHA? Like, how does that actually, I'm totally there, like in spirit, but how does it actually work in practice? Because I think that's where the problems usually tend to arise with these things.
Thank you, Polly. And I'm happy that the awkward silence invited you to pose this question, because I think it's a good one. Imme, we saw you not finding the hand raising button. Please feel free to come in. Then we'll go to Inge after, and then we'll return it to Arjan and Themrise to respond. Imme, please come in.
Great, thanks, Corinne, and thanks for both the presentations. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Imme Widdershoven. I work for IOM in South Sudan on durable solutions for displacement. And also fully agree with everything that's been said so far, but I find myself being a bit stuck in the middle, because this is very much a country with a non-functional government, with recurrent humanitarian crises, acute crises, continued flooding and continued conflict, but also a protracted displacement in areas where people are staying in their displacement situation for a longer period of time, over a decade for now, for many, and where the focus on life saving actually keeps people in that situation. If you would ask, and we do that all the time, if we're talking to people, what would you like? They're not saying we need plastic sheets and we need wash supports, but they're saying we need livelihood support, we need access to land, and these are all things that the government is not and will not be providing in this context. So yeah, I'm just interested in your reflections on this dilemma. What is the role of humanitarian actors in such a space, in advocating for still longer term life making? I haven't heard the term before, but I found it interesting. I'll read up on it. In life making interventions, development actors aren't really present in many locations here. Also recognizing that we shouldn't be putting development trajectories on areas that have their own ways of finding solutions. But as long as we are only offering plastic sheets, we can't support that either. So where's the role of humanitarian actors in there? Thanks, over.
Thank you so much, Emma. Very, very clear question. Yeah. Inge, then, yeah, sorry, your name sounded familiar. I saw the confusion. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, I'm Inge. I work for Coordinate Humanitarian team. I had actually more or less the same question, because I totally agree with that we have to go back to basics. But I'm currently, for example, working on programs in Yemen, and there you see that it's a longer term chronic crisis and conflict. And if I understand it well, we should go back to short-term life saving. But I can't see, while I agree with it, I can't see how to do that in Yemen, where people are in a crisis that is deteriorating. The government cannot cater, and exactly the way out for people to have more livelihood opportunities or to cater for themselves is often not possible. So that's where I see the dilemma. And also wanted to add, with regard to the question who's taking the decisions, I'm a little bit afraid that the decisions are being taken for us, and not so much that, because at a certain moment when there are no resources anymore, then you see that things are, so I think it's very important to have a very clear vision of what we can and cannot do, and that bring that to the fore and to the coordination, let's say, entities we have, and to the players within the humanitarian sector, because otherwise decisions are being taken for us, and then it's just follow where whatever money is there, and that's what we're going to do, what we do to a certain extent anyway. But yeah, my first question was the most pertinent. That's the one that I feel is a dilemma, and I struggle with a lot in my work.
And just Inge, just for clarification, when you say we and us need to have a vision, who do you mean specifically?
The humanitarian organizations, NGOs.
Yeah, okay, thank you, clear. All right, those are a whole bunch of questions. I would like to hand back to Themrise first to respond.
Thanks very much, everybody, for those questions. I may not be able to answer all of them, but I will address the ones that I think are more relevant to my knowledge and experience. I'll take the first one on governance. And that, for me, is a wider issue of the way the humanitarian industry is structured overall. It is next to impossible, from my experience and the little bit of work that I've done in research in this area, is for any of the international bodies to change their governance. This is something we in the industry, the overall aid industry, have been trying for years. And we always hit a brick wall there because the governance is political and it's bureaucratic. So I think the governance is the issue of these organizations and the fact that they consider themselves on a much higher plane than others. I mean, I've heard of people complaining even within these structures and systems that they are unable to operate on the ground because their headquarter governance is so complex. So for me, it's not a matter of restructuring. Again, it's a matter of seeing, do those organizations actually belong on the ground or not? That is what is going to dictate whether or not their governance structures need to be changed or not. Because the question again comes in, I mean, why are they there in the first place? And why are they not giving space to others, particularly within countries? The humanitarian development nexus is something I think that relates to what I've spoken about, the separation between the two. I don't think that nexus was particularly realistic to begin with. I think it was, again, another force fit between the two. So the industry trying to find reasons to bring everything together, primarily because I think of funding and support structures. The more you justify humanitarian aid and development aid, the more you're actually building a case for yourself. So I don't think necessarily there was a confluence of a nexus there. However, having said that, there is also an argument that says if you use development aid to develop a country's capacity to manage its own growth, you are automatically also strengthening the structures that will apply to, for instance, its humanitarian sector. And so you have to have a strong development sector to be able to encourage a strong humanitarian sector. And so there's that connection. But like I've given examples, the two don't necessarily need to coexist in the same space because they come from very different approaches. Who makes these decisions, Polly? I mean, I'm veering towards, again, based on my own personal work, the countries that are at risk. Now, I understand those are that's not a monolith. I mean, you've got countries like, and this goes into the next two questions, Sudan and Yemen, that have very weak or no government structures at all, right? So are they going to make the decision? And I think this needs to be looked at very carefully. So you've got, like Arjan said, you've got a number of countries, majority countries around the world have some sort of functioning government, and they are able to make decisions on their own. It's just that we don't give them the opportunity to do so. And so you've got governments, and something in my experience, again, is that humanitarian agencies never actually ask the government or civil society, what do you need? And we'll bring that to you. It's automatically assumed that this is what they need, and that is come and brought and imposed. So I think the idea of who makes the decisions should be the countries who are at risk, their governance, their civil society. I know it's a very utopian dream, but I mean, if there's a starting point, that's where it should be. I don't want to say too much about the role of non-functioning countries because that is a reality. But we also have to look at how those countries remain non-functioning, and that I think takes you into the global geopolitics aspect of it. So we've got exactly those countries that are partially or wholly responsible for the destruction and the conflict in that part of the world or those specific countries. And then you have humanitarian agencies belonging to exactly those countries coming in and setting up shop. So that conflict of interest and that contradiction is too huge to ignore, because that's part of the whole Western control, political, geopolitical control of power systems, that we're going to destroy you using, indirectly or directly using our political might and military might, but we're also going to send, some medical supplies, and some people can come and, set up shop there. And with all due respect, but, I mean, that contradiction, I think, is what international organizations in countries like this then have to contend with. So that's all I'm going to say on that. One thing I just do want to say about, the idea of opportunity in this current context of the aid cuts, that many countries see it as an opportunity to move ahead and to change, etc. I don't see it as an opportunity. I think the opportunity has always been there. And now we have a reason, to put behind the idea of an opportunity and doing something different. Nothing ever stopped us from doing anything different or doing our own thing our own way. This was just how the system has been designed and built to sort of suppress those voices. So it's not an opportunity right now. I see it as a liberation in a way. The opportunity will come when we actually, in our countries, start coming up with our own ways of doing things, whether it's a humanitarian approach, formal or informal, or whether it's a way of creating our own resources domestically to be able to respond to emergencies, or whether it's our relationship with other countries. And in terms of how we cultivate those relationships, so if there is an emergency, we know which country to approach first for assistance. So I think it's less of an opportunity, it's more of a wake-up call that if we don't do this now, we're never going to be able to come up with anything different or new. Stop there. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
so
for all the
much,
questions.
Themrise, for those very provocative views, I would say, and also holding up the mirror to the field and also beyond it, right? Indeed, what are the larger geopolitical realities that are driving much of the dynamics in the field? I'm going to hand over to Arjan now. And I'm also just reminding us that we do not have a lot of time yet. So I'm afraid that after Arjan's responses, we're going to have to round up. But please, Arjan, take your time for responding first.
You know, the question of South Sudan, so Imme, I worked in South Sudan for a long period of time. I was there in the 2000s for 4 years. And I've been back recently, traveling through Juba to go to the Nuba Mountains. And it's a tough question. I don't have a ready-made answer to you. The only conviction I do have is that humanitarian action is not the answer either. And we are in a place like South Sudan where there's, you know, a shadow, an absence of conflict or a shadow conflict, or there's always violence in the background. But there's no, I mean, at the moment it's a bit different, but over the past 10 years, there was an absence of organized conflict, systematic conflict. Yet there's an absence of capacity. There's arguably an elite that is not interested in providing any public welfare to its population, addressing the basic needs of its population. So what do you do in that situation? Do you do perpetual sort of humanitarian action every year, the same thing, whilst basically compensating for an absence of will and an absence of support, other forms of support, political or developmental, by agencies, by developmental organizations or donors, in order to, over time, build some semblance of capacity? That will take time in order to be able to be effective. Or do we, continuously question ourselves whilst we respond to South Sudan's multiple sort of medical, malnutrition, food security, developmental crisis all the time, without being able to basically address those root causes, because that goes to the politics of the country, the absence of governance, the absence of accountability, the absence of interest of the elites in order to be able to take care of its own population. And we're being put in an impossible situation whereby we take that responsibility because it's the only form of action that is still being funded by donors. They don't want to take the risk of taking other forms of intervention, such as providing fiscal space or fiscal relief or debt relief, or working directly with those governments, because the government of South Sudan is a bit toxic for normal bilateral relationships. And so what they do is basically they fund the UN and NGOs to do the Sisyphean job of basically resolving and addressing perpetual crisis all the time. And so I don't have a ready-made answer to you, but the only thing I'm saying is that humanitarian action is not the answer. And if we try to make it the answer by basically saying, we need to be nexus, we need to be developmental, we need to be long-term, we need to be system building, etc., we basically reform or make humanitarian action into something which it isn't. And still, it is not effective in order to be able to address the crisis in South Sudan. So we're in a particularly difficult situation in South Sudan. Similar in Afghanistan, where donors also don't want to touch the Taliban with a barge pole, and basically they prefer the UN and NGOs to do that work for them, provide basic services in a situation where there's an absence of conflict. And so we allow ourselves to be used for those situations. And that goes to the second question about, you know, who decides. At the moment, the answer is clear. Donors decide. It's not the NGOs themselves. Their policies are largely formed by donors, and they are very dependent on that, and even more so nowadays. And so the independence of humanitarian organizations to define their own policies and their own strategies in particular countries is fairly minimal. If they want to change that, basically they will have to go towards a completely different funding model. And that means basically either getting a much less restricted funding, or much less conditional funding, much less project funding or grant funding, and going more for unrestricted private or unrestricted public money, which is not basically defined on an annual basis with particular objectives in a particular geography, and you need to deliver, otherwise basically we'll disallow you the money that you've gotten from us. And so yeah, I mean, if we want, even if we want basically to share that decision with beneficiaries and clients and states in which we work, then we need to get much more control over the funding source. And that's where there's also an opportunity, because the reduction in government funding will force us basically to go for other forms of funding that are hopefully less conditional. Final point about structure and governance. I have a hard time with this. I'm working in cross-border Sudan at the moment. There's an absence of the UN. The UN is basically beholden to the permission of the government in Port Sudan, and cannot work in areas that are not controlled by Port Sudan. And so in that situation, to imagine, you know, there's lots of questions about what is the UN doing in Sudan? You know, why is it not in non-self-controlled areas, in non-government controlled areas? And that's basically because they are tied to a political system that necessitates them to seek approval from the government in Port Sudan. In the absence of that, what do we do? Do we wait basically for OCHA to show up, or to basically coordinate from afar, and not having set a foot in Darfur? Or do we basically take responsibility between ourselves? I think the UN is getting into a much weaker situation in this period of time. And we will find ourselves more... it will be more necessary for us basically to make our own bet, and to make our own coordination, and to make our own choices together, collectively, as a group of international and national organizations, but without necessarily having the UN to back us up.
Thank you. That was your contribution, right? Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I think that a lot of big questions and a lot of big answers have been discussed. I can imagine people sitting in organizations like, but what does it mean for me tomorrow? But I think this was really meant to be, at the higher level, and rethinking the system as a whole, and even its context, right? So we're going to have to close here to respect everyone's time. We're a little bit over time, but we really appreciate all you coming here and engaging with the speakers. And let's keep these conversations going. As said, we have 2 more sessions coming up. The next one is about diversifying in terms of donors. So we'll be talking about Gulf donors also. We're in for an engaging conversation there too, I guess. Please register via the website again. You will also receive an email from us if you have attended this session. And we wish you all a very good rest of the day. Thank you so much for being here.